Hello, this is Jamie Stevenson from Tech Valley Gamespace. Thanks for joining us for our second episode of the Game Club podcast, in which we discuss the game Lisa, also known as Lisa the Painful RPG. As always, we encourage listeners to try out the game before proceeding, so that you'll have some more experience and context to allow you to follow along more closely with the group discussion. Before we jump into this episode's discussion, we would also like to provide some advance warning for listeners that the game we're discussing in this episode, as implied by its moniker of Lisa the Painful RPG, does contain some particularly gruesome subject matter that may prove upsetting to certain listeners, including portrayals of drug addiction, child abuse, gore and physical mutilation, as well as psychological and sexual torment, including discussion of rape. For anyone attempting to play the game before listening, please be forewarned that these elements are a part of the content of Lisa, and as such, the game may not be considered appropriate for all listeners. As you may expect, due to the nature of the game itself, our discussion of the game also delves into many of the aforementioned topics. Please be advised that this episode's discussion also includes explicit language. With that said, we now present the group discussion of our second Game Club selection, Lisa the Painful RPG.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Tech Valley Gamespace Game Club, where we discuss about games like book clubs. All of us have already played this game. It is a game called Lisa, also known as Lisa the RPG or Lisa the Painful RPG. And I guess we'll go through this. I'll go through very quickly the description of it, and I guess we introduce ourselves as we talk. Lisa, this is my description of the game. Lisa is a stressful turn-based RPG, JRPG, that takes a game genre often used for power fantasies and turns it into a survival thriller. In the near future, all woman has died. The weather has turned the lands desolate. Brad, a middle-aged nobody, finds a small baby girl after one of his joy drug binges and decides to raise her in secret. By the time Brad's adoptive daughter, Buddy, grows into her tweens, a breakout occurs, leaving one of Brad's friends dead and Buddy missing. Furious, Brad ventures through Olathe to find his baby girl. Using Nintendo's classic Earthbound as inspiration, Lisa swiftly jumps from comedy, tragedy, and surreal horror without skipping a beat. The majority of the human enemies are unique, with funny dialogue and devastating attacks. Some permanently kills your party members. With many surprises and uncomfortable choices, Lisa grabs you right from the beginning and never lets go. This was originally created by one solo developer named Austin Jorgensen. Apologies for the mispronunciation of probably the last name. And is actually a sequel to the game called Lisa the First, though kind of like the Final Fantasies, no previous knowledge of that game is necessary to play through the game. As a quick backdrop information, this is a Kickstarter game, so anyone who plays it, if you're curious as to why we start talking about Let's Players in this discussion, that's because a lot of Let's Players have actually backed the Kickstarter campaign and therefore makes a cameo appearance throughout the whole game. The Kickstarter campaign was originally called Lisa: the Painful RPG, which is why I say it's also known as that. Its tagline was a game about survival, sacrifice, and perverts. And in Austin's word, he said, "I want the world of Lisa to be hard on the player. I hate playing a game knowing that if I make a choice, it has to be the one I know the game wants me to do, or the safe option, or the one that leads to the good ending. The choices you make will change the core mechanics of the game. It's not superficial. I want the player to really have to make sacrifices and for the game to affect the interior core of your experiences." So, having started with that, let's start with kind of like the introduction of the game, and let's kind of see what your thoughts are. So, take it ahead, everyone, and let's see where we go with this. So, when I talk about the introduction, I mean like the first 15 minutes of the game. If you like search on YouTube, that's what you kind of find out. Mm-hmm. So, I guess I'll start, or Jamie, you're about to open your mouth.
Okay. I thought, yeah. I wasn't sure if you were meaning we were going to like go around and then each kind of say something about it to start. But yeah, I can start. I may have played the least of the game out of anybody, so it's kind of
right. That's fair enough.
I'm a little bit more interested to get other people's initial thoughts than my own. But yeah, I mean, just to give context, I think it'd be a good idea maybe for us to say how much of it we did play because it's a fairly lengthy game. I got about 3 hours in. I got as far as fighting like a hair monster or something, and I couldn't beat the hair monster, and I didn't have time. I was actually playing it like right up until kind of we started the discussion, and then I watched some Let's Plays of other kind of various just randomly chosen points throughout the game. As far as the first 15 minutes went, so I should also mention that, I mean, I came into playing the game with some
oh, excuse me. I forgot to clarify this from the beginning. If you plan on playing this game, and probably if you also plan on playing Earthbound, this discussion will have spoilers all over the place. So if you plan on playing it, close this conversation right now, close YouTube, everything, and then start play the game.
Yeah, and then come back.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I had like I had looked at the Kickstarter page, as you mentioned, like when I found out this was going to be the game for this next meeting, and so I kind of was trying to get an idea of the tone. I love Earthbound and the Mother series, so I mean I was interested in that as an influence. And then but unfortunately I didn't get to play it as early as I would have liked, so I was kind of hearing some other people's first impressions as they played it as well. So I kind of went into it with some expectations, particularly about the kind of hard choices, as mentioned. Like I kind of had some idea of what to expect in that regard. So yeah, I mean, I kind of was cringing a little going into it. Like I was ready for like hard choices from the start. And maybe because of that expectation, like I didn't find it to be like as painful as I was maybe expecting, in the first 15 minutes at least. Yeah. So yeah, the kind of intro story, I mean, it's all just like cutscene was kind of how I felt for the first 15 minutes. It felt like a good 10 minutes of cutscene at least. And it was fine. I liked the way that it told a lot of story without dialogue in the beginning, just through kind of animations and stuff. Yeah, that kind of made it. Well, anyway, we'll talk about kind of the dialogue and the writing in the game, but I think that kind of played to the strengths of the game a little more. Just this kind of wordless, right. These vignettes of like this time with the interaction between Brad and Buddy, I guess it is. So yeah, it intrigued me in the beginning. Made me want to keep going. That's about all I have to say about the first 15 minutes, really.
I guess we're going to go in either clockwise or counterclockwise direction.
Or random.
Yeah, that sounds good. Dylan?
Yeah,
how long have you played about it, and your opinions about the first 15 minutes?
I played a little longer than Jamie. I got to roughly with the second town, region, whatever they're being called, Crossroads, the greenish one. The first 15 minutes I really enjoyed. It really captures your attention. It starts off with a very nice upbeat, retro sounding tune, and next thing you know, you're getting your ass beat. So it really does set the tone of the game right from the beginning.
Yep.
It works very well for the game. And in the long run, I didn't feel the choices were as difficult as they're made out to be, just because of the way the game evolves over time. The sacrifices you make can be compensated with other things. So in the end, I don't think that stuff was as much of a big deal as people made them out to be.
Fair enough. Alana? How long have you played it?
Probably even less than Jamie. I played. Well, I got to just after the part where you have to make a big decision, maybe for the first time, of do you sacrifice your gear or your new friend? And I tend not to like games with cutscenes, so the fact that so much of the game is, or so much of this person's history is going by without you really doing too much. I generally kind of get bored, or I don't know. I wish it was like a little bit less cutscene and more interactive. Especially, I mean, like, I guess with 3D games, that tends to be the way things are done is, you know, these completely movie-like scenes where you're not doing really much. But like in retro 2D games, I don't know. I think it's not done quite as much. I don't know. I guess it depends. I tend not to play a lot of those kind of JRPGs, but you know, I'm not like a huge Final Fantasy fan, or I do have some of them though. But yeah, I just, in terms of the starter games, I kind of want to get right into, you know, the mechanics of the game and kind of learn things as I go, rather than having all this story just kind of thrown on top of you.
Makes sense. Anthony?
You want me in my opinion on the first 15 minutes?
Just talk about how long you've played it, and then, your opinion about the first 15 minutes.
I played it to a point and stopped because I didn't like the game. I didn't like the choices. I didn't like the humor. There pretty much nothing I liked about this game. I guess the first 15 minutes were okay. Well, I mean, the things happening were awful, but it's just the beginning.
It always goes downhill.
To provide some context, so the first beginning discusses right off the bat with a tough issue about parental abuse. And this actually sets the really nice tone for, because the prequel was also about parental abuse, almost mainly about it, whereas, you know, Lisa, the RPG, takes things even beyond further than that and starts throwing even more triggers into the whole environment. So it's interesting that you guys mentioned that decisions weren't something that was very compelling to you guys. I wanted to know more about that very quickly. The first decision, for the first like real main hard decision, for example, was between Terry's life and all of your belongings. So yeah, when you first saw that, what was your reaction to that?
So my initial reaction to it, so as I mentioned, I had heard about kind of some of these choices ahead of time. I think my reaction would have been the same either way, which is like, when I encounter these types of things in games, I usually tend to be framing them in terms of the designer more than like, I sometimes have a hard time suspending my disbelief, particularly with very like kind of choices that feel very kind of arbitrary and feel imposed on you, like in a very kind of draconian, like heavy-handed way. Like that to me is just, I feel like I can almost see the designer like sitting in a room, like thinking that up, like kind of like going, you know, and sometimes that can bug me a little. I mean, the thing that I thought was kind of interesting about my reaction to it compared to the description that you were reading at the beginning, which I'm not sure where that description was from, but the
Kickstarter page.
Okay, so then the notion, or that I guess this was formulated before the game was made, but the kind of idea that these choices would really drastically alter the gameplay in some way is a very interesting thing to me, because I don't know, I tend to just, my own interest gravitates a little more towards like the mechanic system side of things or whatever. So, but I didn't find that to be the case. Like, regardless of my reaction to that initial choice, like I chose to just have them take my stuff or whatever it was, because whatever it was, like I didn't have that much stuff, and it wasn't really a hard choice in that case. It obviously escalates from there, and I guess they do get a little more difficult depending on what you consider difficult. But I didn't find that they were really affecting the gameplay that much. Like they weren't changing the style of the game or the way that I had to approach anything in it any differently, apart from just like, now I'm in a shittier position where I have less money or I have less stuff or whatever. And that's like, I don't know, that I didn't find that personally to be super intriguing. Like, and based on that description, if I had backed the Kickstarter, I think I would have been expecting a little bit more based on that description. Like, I mean, yeah, to jump ahead, like they take your arm and whatever else is like one of the options, and that can affect like the attacks you can do. But it still is just kind of like paring away kind of options or items, like stuff. It's taking away like resources rather than really fundamentally altering anything about the way the game plays. And that just doesn't match up with that description to me. So that was where I found to be less interesting than, as I said, I read the Kickstarter, so I probably had some more things like that in mind, and I just didn't personally encounter anything in my playthrough or watching the Let's Play that I felt fulfilled that. And that was my main source of disappointment with the choices.
Yeah, going to the first choice where you have to pick Terry's life or your stuff. I could imagine, if you're in a post-apocalyptic desert, your stuff would be important to you.
Right.
But it's a video game, and you can go find a place where you can grind and get more money and get more money and get more money and buy everything that you just lost. So there really is no sense of loss if you take that route. And then on the other hand, the game has 20 some odd playable characters or something. So if you lose Terry up front, there's 19 other people to replace it with. So.
Right.
There's this kind of thing that like I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts about, because I just want to find out like how people respond to this stuff. But for a while I was really obsessed with the idea of like ethical choices in games, and I was doing like a lot of research on trying to find any game that had any kind of approach to like ethical choices in any way, or like somehow simulating like ethics, which is just a weird notion to begin with. And so I read a lot of like different academic like debates related to it, but the ones that were most interesting to me were like game designers discussing it. So there were some designers that I really liked that were having some really heated debates about like approaches to ethical decisions in games. And there was one designer in particular that I respect a lot, who was taking what I think other people felt was kind of an extreme stance about the topic, where he was basically saying like, but I've heard other designers, Ken Levine has said this as well, the designer of BioShock and stuff, that like when you make an ethical choice in real life, like you have your conscience that kind of like guides you right or wrong. Like we might have different subjective like sense of conscience or whatever, but like it's kind of a primal thing, conscience. Like I think to some degree, like it kind of operates on a very innate level. Whereas like in a game where it's fundamentally like you can suspend your disbelief, but you're still somewhere in your mind are aware that this is an artificial environment. So in that case, like to let your friend die or whatever to get like a game advantage, like I don't often find that to be very interesting, because I don't have a whole lot of ethical feeling one way or the other about what happens to this person who doesn't exist. Basically, like I said again, it probably relates to what I was saying before about sometimes having difficulty with suspension of disbelief, where it's like, yeah, I mean, it's just more a matter of like, I don't really care. I don't care if like the tutorial character gets killed or if I lose my stuff. Like I wasn't like sitting there biting my nails over it in particular. It was just kind of like a thing to get through for me.
It's really interesting about how you guys are mentioning that the first decision is pretty easy. And the short answer is because it's designed that way. If you sacrifice Terry's life, that team will take Terry away, and then he comes back incredibly powerful, and you have to fight him. And some of his moves like perma kills your enemy, or perma kills your party member. So like it's actually a very devastating choice, but something that comes along very farther end of the game. So certain choices that affects the gameplay, they have this really weird after effect where things get magnificently harder as a consequence of making those, versus the more immediate ones are the ones that you like more attached to, right? So especially in regards to like losing your arm, for example, you'll be that one you'll be like, okay, you just suffer a bunch of stat decreases. That should be pretty easy to deal with. What it also causes is withdrawal status effect. And right from the beginning, you will experience a lot of withdrawal status effects where it turns Brad's attacks into absolute zero and completely turn him into an ineffective party member. And by cutting off his arm, you're basically making him a lot more prone to that. So that's kind of like the way the game designer was imagining when you're playing throughout the game to really make you hit hard with the whole drug addiction topic throughout the entire game.
I think, too, the level of difficulty that you play it on might have you reacting drastically different. I started out playing it on the hard mode. I don't know if anyone else did, but you'll notice right off the bat that once you use a safe spot, it disappears. So it's like you can't just go back and do something and grind and fill up your life and go back and keep trying doing the same thing over and over again. So having 15, 20 guys in easy mode or normal mode, whatever it is, doesn't have a big impact on it. But as you're playing through the advanced mode, you might just be losing characters left and right from permadeath type stuff.
Yeah, I wasn't playing in pain mode or whatever the more difficult mode is called. So.
Yeah, I went on normal after about an hour's worth of pain mode because I wanted to try and get through it for this discussion. But
I definitely was doing the traditional, just like going back to save slots, trying different choices for all these points and all the typical things that players would do to kind of abuse these systems, So,
you basically didn't experience the echo effect on some of the decisions, which would significantly lessen the impact of said decisions. Fair enough. Another thing that's really interesting that you guys pointed out was that you mentioned that party members were disposable. In total, there are actually 30 recruitable members of them. And this actually, to me, the part that I found the most interesting about the game. Because you would think that with 30 recruitable members, they'll be disposable, right? And the game is specifically designed with several mechanics in mind to make you feel not that way. And I wanted to kind of discuss about that, and especially towards the end frame of the game where the decisions genuinely become harder as a consequence of these mechanics stacking up. So the first one is the fact that you can't actually change your party member at any time. There are very specific spots, and they're not even safe spots either. There are very specific spots on the map where you can actually change characters. What do you guys think about that?
I think that was more of an annoyance than a feature. So, if you really wanted to change a party member, you track back to a spot where you can change out and then jump back. So I don't think it really added to it.
I think... sorry. Sometimes when you go to sleep, your party members get kidnapped.
Yeah.
Which adds, I think, more to how awful the game is. And I don't mean awful mechanically or whatever. It's just there to make you feel bad.
Do you guys try actually sleeping on the sleeping spots?
Yeah, I did. I lost a party member that way. It was one of my more useful party members. So, but again, it just fell under the general category that felt like all the decisions were falling under for me. And maybe this has more to do with my own personality and playstyle than the game. But it was just everything was more about a resource trade-off of do I want to risk doing this to heal versus the potential bad side? Everything was just kind of a cost benefit analysis. It was really dry experience.
That's kind of what I liked about the game for me, though.
I don't know. I do like that kind of thing in some other games. I didn't particularly like deciding whether or not to sleep at the fire and seeing what would happen. But I don't think it's an inherently bad thing. It kind of gets across the world. There are a lot of things mechanically that get across, as you said, Dylan, this kind of wasteland environment and just the terrible kind of condition of the world and stuff. I just there was a lot of stuff then tonally. I hope we get into just discussing like the tone of the writing that I felt like undermined that. But yeah, mechanically, like it's kind of sound in terms of, I mean, there's a lot of shitty things happening that reinforce like this is a tough place to live and do anything. So, but I kind of got the point of that really quick, and then it just made it like more of a pain to play, which is, I suppose, maybe the point.
I don't like the whole campfire things happening. It's just not I don't want to say it's unrealistic because it's a video game taking place in a future where there's zombies and everything, but you got a party of 30 some odd people, even if you only have 4 at a time, you keep one person awake so you don't get kidnapped or beat in the middle of the night.
Or farted on.
Yeah, so that's an example of like just the tonal break. It's just farting. Anyway.
There's also the fact that, you know, all the enemies are, I shouldn't say all, the grand majority of them are unique in the sense that you kill them once, they're gone forever. What do you guys think about that?
That's neat.
For assessment.
Yeah. I mean, I like that there were a lot of kind of unique sprites in the game. It did feel like a world that was populated with quite a wide variety of characters, many of whom were off-putting in different ways. So I guess you could say there was variety in that sense. I mean, there were a lot of characters that you end up fighting and potentially killing that aren't really necessarily posing a direct threat. Yeah. The game just kind of puts you in a position where you're fighting them and then deciding what to do. And sometimes it gives you a choice. Other times it's kind of guiding you that way. I'm trying to think of examples. Like, I mean, obviously there's a bit, even in the first 3 hours I was doing, where you have to, you can fight some like this rando gang. There's like 4 members around in this area, and they're all basically like, one's asleep and you can just attack him and then fight him. He wakes up halfway through you attacking him and doesn't really fight back, and you kill him. The other one is like, says, hey, I'll tell you some information. It's useful if you like let me live. And you can just say yes or no at that point, and then he'll tell you the information, which is a fairly useful like game hint, and then you can still decide whether or not to kill him. But then there's another character that wants you to kill all 4 of those, and you have to go back and then kill that character if you want to like fulfill that quest. If you like, I thought that was actually the next place I had to go. I was like basically stuck at that point, like trying random stuff. I was like, okay, this is the only thing I can see to do, so I did it. And then I was like, oh, this is like a side quest, so I can get some gasoline to make fire bombs. And I was like, well, great. I just killed some people, you know, like for no reason. But I was doing that a lot in the game, so I was kind of numb to it by that point, I guess. But yeah, it did. I mean, it did make me feel marginally shitty, to the extent that, again, killing a fake thing can make me feel shitty.
Well, even in that scenario, I kept trying to find ways to not do things like when I first played and found the orphanage and killed all the kids. Yeah. I just restored my save point and didn't go back to the orphanage.
I hated that. Yeah. I absolutely. That was like probably the first point in the game where I was like very irritated.
And then the part where you have to kill the 4 rando gang members just to be able to make gas bombs. By the time I got back to the thing you probably need the gas bombs for, I really didn't use my gas bomb, so I could have bypassed all that. So instead of going back and recovering that 2 hours and stuff, I just let it go at that point.
Yeah, it would have been one thing for me, I suppose, if I had known why I needed like fire bombs. Like I hadn't fought whatever boss you fight that fire bombs are useful on. I think I encountered that after. I had fire bombs at that point, so I was like, oh, okay.
They just do a lot of damage and cause burning. So
yeah, I think the first mutant that, well, not the first one that you have to kill to get the bicycle. Yeah, I think the guy in front of him says he doesn't look like he likes fire or something. So I think that's the.
I don't think I would have been able to beat that boss without fire bombs. I wasn't really like leveling very much at all. I was just trying to kind of plow through. I was not grinding.
Actually, grinding is like really hard to do in this game. Yeah, because there's specifically 2 variants of enemies that you can grind across. One which gives you pathetic amount of experience points for a bunch of money, and the other one which has a very high chance of poisoning you. So the game is specifically designed such that it's very difficult to get experience points as much as possible. And, basically with unique enemies, you have to kind of commit to the party members that you have. In fact, it's actually really interesting from a systems perspective, because you realize very quickly that not changing your party members is actually the most optimal way to play. Because you want to make sure that, whatever party members you have with are the strongest possible.
Of course, that would potentially be a mistaken assumption. Like, you might realize that, in air quotes, before you know they can get taken away so easily.
Right.
But if a party member can get abducted on a whim or perma-killed super easily, or you're forced to potentially kill them as part of this lesser of two evils thing, then, it might make more sense to spread out your levels a little more. But you might not know that up front, so you get the kind of Eris from Final Fantasy VII effect where, a lot of people were more upset that they lost a character that they'd put a bunch of levels into than they were about losing a character that they actually cared about on a story level, which is, on some level, I think, a failure, or at least it's not necessarily what I think was intended. But I think that's part of the kind of pulling in two potentially different directions that you get when it's a game character, right? It's simultaneously this repository for stats, and also meant to be a character in this fictional world that you care about on a character level. These characters, I didn't feel like there were any that really, if there is a really kind of well realized character, sometimes that tension can be a little bit stronger for me. I feel like I'm presenting it I just look at it totally on a stat level, and that's not true. It depends on the quality of the writing and stuff. But these characters, the characters that I got anyway, because I know you don't necessarily have to get the same ones, are they were just wacky. I wasn't that invested in them.
Well, the interaction with the characters is really limited to when you pick them up, how you recruit them, and maybe a cutscene at the end.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you don't really get any character development outside of Brad and whoever's tormenting you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for the most part, all the characters are one-note, one-sided things. But it's kind of supposed to be like a Adventure Time syndrome, where you end up loving them for being so hilariously one-note in a way. I'm personally a real big fan of Harvey Alabaster, who is a bipedal fish that you can recruit, the obligatory curveball character that you get. And he's just a lawyer that hates humans, but you just end up loving him for having such a hilarious introduction, where he's trying to basically convince the judge that he wants to get out of the whole court process entirely. Actually, that's a pretty good question. How many party members have you recruited, and which ones have you really utilized, if any?
By the point that I've got up to, I think I've only recruited 7 or 8.
Mm-hmm.
I was heavily using Nern and I forget the name of the Indian, one with the crossbow. Or the bow and arrow.
Olathe.
Yeah. It seemed, from what I played and watching through the some of the Let's Play stuff, pairing up certain characters really had a benefit. Because Olathe starts out with no, I forget which ability it is, but basically Nerd, you buff other people with him, and all of a sudden this guy's a cannon and taking stuff out. But.
Jamie?
I didn't get far enough to even get rid of Terry, the tutorial character, and I desperately wanted to. I mean, I saved Terry as part of the choice, and then I found I got the archer, I recruited the pro wrestler, and so whatever. I had a full party at one point, and then almost immediately my archer got abducted, and then I was back to using Terry again. And that's as far as I really got with it.
Mm-hmm. Alana, Anthony.
I was just at the point where you decide about Terry's life, or just after that, so I didn't really get.
That's right. So that means that he was the only one you recruited.
And I feel like it was pretty worthless. So I mean, to me, it was again a choice between stuff that was actually potentially useful, and somebody that was just like a damaged sponge. That, so I mean, that character was kind of, like you said about them, even though that was the only sidekick for me, I wasn't like invested in the character or anything.
Mm-hmm.
He just seemed like I was more expecting him to like turn on you or something because he was so unuseful. So, I mean, I generally play games trying to make the decisions that I would make. Mm-hmm. So, like, I would choose somebody's life over stuff, even if there was no good reason to keep the guy around. I usually play as the good character when I play games, so, the moral decision is somebody's life is more valuable than your stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, and I also don't like grinding either, so I tend not to try to power game it. I can't comment on the other. I can't comment on the other people sidekicks.
At its core, it is very resource management intensive.
Huh? Yeah,
the game. Is. So whether experience in this game is very limited, well, not very limited, but is a limited place. There's very few places you can grind. Mm-hmm. The amount of time you spend on each player is limited. So when you just look at that, it's just resource management.
Right. I think that's a fair analysis. Anthony, do you get far enough to have a party?
I didn't like Nern. I didn't think... Was his intro supposed to be funny? Because it was just like a long-winded intro and he was a complete asshole.
Yeah, he is.
Is that the orator character?
Yes, the guy that keeps talking.
The gun.
Talking
I hated that character. I hated that. That might have come before the other bit with the orphanage. I can't remember which came first. Whichever one it was pissed me off to no end. It's like, this character is a piece of shit. Basically, like, I absolutely, like, it's this long-winded, like, oh, my wife is so ugly, like, it's just this really basically misogynistic, like, long-winded diatribe, and then he's in your party. Mm-hmm. And he's like one of the first people to join you, at least he was for me. Mm-hmm. Like, I hadn't even encountered like the way to switch out my party members yet. Mm-hmm. And it was just it was an exercise in frustration.
Yeah. I do think he was deliberately designed to be that way. I'm more than certain that the person, Austin, was clear in the sense that he was supposed to be a complete asshole. So,
is that, I mean, in your opinion, like, is that what we're meant to think about most of the characters in this world? Because there's a lot of characters that have that kind of streak.
And what about the humor in general? Is this humor Austin's sense of humor, or is this the humor he thinks is awful and wants to
be just like another part of the pain?
Yeah, to inflict this on you.
I'm not really quite certain. I can't speak for him, obviously, right?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't really know him, like what else he's done or what.
But in regards to some characterization being complete terrible people, really, I do think that there were very deliberate decisions, and I do think that the creator knew that they were very terrible people. I think that it was a very deliberate decision to do so. In regards to the sense of humor, I think that was more about something where he just had a bunch of ideas and kind of put them together in a way that seemed to make sense for the world, especially since the world is terrible in all meaning, in all ways possible. So it would make sense that the humor would be as well.
So, yeah, I mean, we were talking a little bit the other day because, again, as I mentioned, like, a couple of people had played it, and we've been having some discussions like at the game space, just in a general way about like our first impressions, our first kind of feelings of it. And because I hadn't played it yet, I was kind of trying not to hear too many specifics, but man, I don't know. Like, yeah, I like a lot of kind of dystopian fiction, I guess, and things that take place in what is meant to be like a horrible, ruined world or whatever. But generally, you need some kind of like entryway into that world, like a character. For me, anyway, like I need a character that is likable on some level. For me to be able to like somebody for me to root for. If it's just like a movie or a book, like it can't be just like characters that are either like so wacky that they're totally kind of unrelatable and kind of don't fit into that setting, or like I don't know, like I just need something to kind of hang my interest on, like rather than in order to like justify spending time in like a very painful environment, because then it becomes about like what is the character doing to try to like overcome that. And I don't know, like I just didn't necessarily have that effect for me. And also like the wacky humor I found really like tonally jarring like with that environment. Like I just didn't, it was too many like abrupt shifts for me. And again, it just like, for me, it just produces a numbing effect where it's just like, I can only like emotionally follow along with like, okay, now there's like a Power Ranger, now there's like a pro wrestler, now like the most horrible shit you can imagine is like happening to a person, like, and just cutting back and forth between those is like, it gets to be too much for me at a certain point. Whereas there's some like, directors and writers that I think do kind of manage to marry like some amount of like levity with like really dark material in a way that does work for me. But it was another thing, like I guess I'm really thinking about it because, again, from that initial description from the Kickstarter, like that was the other thing that stood out to me that I felt like didn't hold true for me, was the like Lisa switches, it says some line about Lisa switches back and forth between like lighthearted whatever, like humor and tragedy, like completely skillfully or something. And that I really felt like it didn't, like it just I was getting like whiplash going back and forth between the tones of the game, I felt like.
Actually, that's really interesting. So for the people who obviously played it a lot farther, how do you think of how the narrative was being slowly introduced? And when I say that, it always felt like, so in a lot of RPGs, you either are kind of, railroaded into a narrative, or you just somehow run into it. And Lisa kind of takes the latter approach, where it's your curiosity that makes you go through various numbers of narratives, some unavoidable and others completely avoidable. Humor segments being one of them, but other segments being like flashbacks and so forth. What do you guys think about that?
Like which? Give me an example.
There's a part very early on, right after you're given a choice to sacrifice Terry or all your items, where you can walk into a hut. The hut's completely empty, and you look all around, you're like, okay, whatever. And then you walk outside, and then suddenly your dad's apparition appears and says, you take care of her, and drops a baby girl right on you.
Yeah, that's more interesting to me than getting farted on.
It's a high bar to clear.
But like, there's a lot of segments for me that I've encountered where they do something like that. Dylan, you have?
Well, I think those segments are very much online with what Jamie was saying, where it goes from one thing and then you whip to something else.
Right.
Like one of the big ones was having to play Russian roulette, where you had to pick one of your characters.
Oh yeah, that was
that could have been
so
a way to get
wrenching.
rid of the guy that taught Nerd. He had to shoot himself, but then you go through that and then you're out and you're playing happy music again, and you're back on doing your thing.
That was forced, right? There was no way around that.
There was no way around that.
It's forced, but then you can go back and compete for more money or more magazines and stuff. But
you also unlock one more party member doing so.
And if you keep going until everyone else on the other side is dead, I think that's how you get the other character.
Yep,
So.
buckets. Completely mute. Yeah, actually, believe it or not, so Anthony, don't hate me on this, the Russian roulette was my favorite part. Because it's the part that tore me apart the worst. I get there and I'm like, oh god, no, I don't want my party member to die. So that was like one of those parts that really affected me. I don't know, I know for you, Jamie, you didn't get far enough for anything to affect you, but for the people who actually made it to the Russian roulette part, what was like your first reaction to that?
Yeah, this is bullshit. But, you know, it's really just a variation on picking your stuff or another character. At this point, there's a chance that you are going to lose a character no matter what. So at that point, it's which character do you dislike the most?
There's also, I think this is up to where Anthony got to, there's also an option where you can blow off your entire party. And actually, now that I think of it, so the Russian roulette part actually happens immediately after you have a choice of either, losing your arm or losing one of your party members, right? Incidentally, you gain a party member in between those two segments, but nonetheless, it kind of happens in a very consecutive fashion. So, like, what do you guys think about that? The fact that, you think like, oh, this decision is now over, and then the game basically pulls the rug under you and say, nope, you have one more terrible decision to make.
It's hard because it goes back to the whole trying to do ethics in video games. It's not everything is a black and white, and there's always some other shade of gray, and you're not presented with a shade of grayness. It's either you do one thing or another. Right.
It's more like gray and black, if anything.
Yeah. It's a bit of a downer.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about it in terms of like the lesser of two evils choices, which it seems like pretty much every decision the game gives you is like a lesser of two evils thing. But again, it's like just, I don't know. The scenarios are so outlandish that it just doesn't like link up for me with anything that's like relevant to an ethical, like a real ethical choice that I'd face in my life. Usually is like way more, there's way more gray area even than that. As you said, it's like, it feels like a very heavy-handed thing.
Sometimes when you also have another choice sometimes with this character to fight them. You say, no, I'm not going to make any of those choices. I'm going to fight you instead. And then you fight him and he beats you in one hit. He says, don't waste my time or whatever. And that's... Let's just get to the part where I quit. So this part was pretty gross to me. So there's three choices. You could fight him. You could choose to lose all three people of your party. Or the character has the little girl you've been trying to save. And he says that he'll cut off her nipple. So, if you choose to cut her nipple off, you receive it. You have it in your inventory, and it gives you like stats if you equip it. And in the caption, it says a reminder of your choices. And that's when I quit.
And understandably so. It's one of those really shocking moments in the game that, at least to me, at first glance, looks like it was there for shock value. But as I played along further, I felt like there was an actual narrative relevance to that. And I know, so basically, long story short, right after that, you, for whatever reason, end up in the EWC where you can do wrestling, but immediately after that, the game goes full-on hallucinogenic, where nothing starts to make sense, and you're really unsure whether what you're interacting with, what the world you're in, is actually real or not. And that's kind of, I thought, where narrative-wise, it makes it clear that, the lead character you're playing as, Brad, has practically lost all his sanity at that point, which becomes a, vital narrative point towards the end of the game. And I thought it was really cool that, the game never points that out ever, that, Brad is losing his sanity every time he's going through the game. But at the same time, there's a bunch of clues in the universe itself that gives you that understanding. So I was wondering if any of you guys also encountered moments where it made you question kind of like who you're playing as.
It didn't make me question who I was playing as, but I could see if the game was a turn-off for people and they didn't play it all the way through, that's something that'd be completely lost on them. And I didn't really pick up on it either until you start getting force-fed joy, and the guy was like, it doesn't matter what you do at this point, I've taken care of it, or whatever the line was. So
I didn't like that part either.
Yeah, where you see the really tall, sticky character, and it's like really bizarre and weird. So actually, this kind of segues nicely towards the ending. I know a number of you have already spoiled it for yourself because you were not able to play it that far, and I can understand that. Well, first off, what do you think about the ending? If you can also describe it as well, that would be great.
Okay, I'll describe the ending.
Sure.
You make it to a point where you have to sail to an island to get to Buddy. She's run away from you because she thinks you're a monster at this point, basically. And you leave your party to go get her. This was probably a little farther back than the end, but go to the island. She runs away from you again. Well, before that, the guy that ships you to the island, he's saying he's doing it to get laid, and you kill him instantly.
Right.
You find her, she runs away from you again. You use his corpse as a boat to get to the last stage. I think that's how it was. And then at that point, you're just mindlessly killing anything that gets in your way to get to Buddy, even your friends and your son or whatever he was to you at that point. And
well, not mindlessly. They're trying to stop Brad now.
No, Brad's mindlessly killing everyone around him.
Well,
not mind.
They're in it. They're.
I'm doing it to get this girl, and
yeah, they're talking to him and telling him, "I'm not going to let you do that." So in his mind, he's saying, "Yes, no, you're not. I'm going. I'm going to do this thing." There is a thought in his mind, I guess.
But I think that there are other options other than him getting her back, and the game doesn't open him up to that possibility that Brando's not a bad person, and the Rando army aren't bad. But you're not given that option. You kill your friends, you kill Rando army, you kill Rando. You might eat her at the end after you turn into a joy mutant. You don't know, because that's when it cuts off.
Right. So basically, very literally, the lead character, Brad, becomes a monster, as Buddy kept saying he was. Anyways, when you first saw that, what was basically your reaction?
Which piece? Because when you're fighting your friends, they're not even really fighting back. They're crying and they're held down, and it's not even a challenge at that point. You can just do whatever you want. That was kind of depressing. I had the same reaction as the characters, that at that point, you're just sitting there pressing the button to get to the end.
Right. Jamie, you want to add anything to that?
I don't have a lot to add on the ending. I watched Let's Plays, as I said, like I just kind of randomly went through a Let's Play because I didn't have time, just in the past hour basically, and I watched the ending, but I mean, I feel like I missed some key story scenes where maybe it would have made more sense or been more emotionally affecting in some way. Like I don't want to like judge it without having all the context, I guess.
So when Austin mentioned that this game was inspired by Earthbound, he actually specified exactly what part of it he was inspired by. And that is the ending where you fight against Gygas. Have you guys seen that segment before or actually played through it?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that very briefly?
Well, I mean, it's considered to be kind of the most disturbing part of Earthbound is the end. Itoi, the writer / I guess designer, you could say, has mentioned some inspirations for it being kind of a sort of horror movie, is my understanding anyway, that he saw like as a young child that sort of like scarred him a little bit. So it is a very disturbing sequence, the final boss in Earthbound, and it's a sort of creature that you're fighting that is meant to be like something that you can't really fully comprehend like what it is. So it's not just like an evil like monster thing. It's like kind of this incorporeal, like very, very disturbing in terms of like audio and visual presentation thing, like entity that's kind of beyond your human understanding. And yeah, I mean, there's a couple other parts as well that are quite disturbing, I would say, in Earthbound.
Pooh's trains.
Yeah, but
that's
that
actually my like favorite part of the game too.
Yeah, and there seems to be a bit within here sort of referencing that in Lisa, which was interesting. That other segment as well. But yeah, I mean that kind of makes it make a little more sense to me, because when I was just thinking of this game as I was playing through in terms of like comparison to the Earthbound / Mother series, which as I mentioned I love, like I just felt like, you know, as I was mentioning, like those tonal shifts, right? Like Earthbound is a game, and that series in general like has a lot of comedy and it has some very like dark, disturbing moments. Right. But the balance I feel like is way more skewed towards like lighthearted, and then sometimes some really disturbing or just confusing stuff happens, and that kind of like swings you back. Like it doesn't kind of leave you in there for like 20 hours or whatever and kind of make you slog through it. Whereas this being inspired more by just that bit, which is universally like the most disturbing, considered the most disturbing part of Earthbound, then it feels like a game that like by somebody who really liked that bit and then wanted to stretch that out to almost, to me, to like the breaking point, to a length that like it doesn't really work for me when it's stretched out that much. It works more as like a standalone segment at the end of something that's generally more lighthearted, or just a little piece that's dropped in there. But yeah, I don't know.
There was one more topic I wanted to talk about, which is, you know, topic about JRPGs in general and how Lisa fits into that. At least for me, I feel like Lisa is a deconstruction of the JRPG narrative tropes, etc., in the sense that it really makes fun of it, in the sense of, you know, kind of ruining the genre in a lot of ways through both its mechanical and narrative beams. You have, for example, Brad, which it's been clear throughout the entire conversation you had a hard time relating to, right? And I feel like that was a very deliberate decision to kind of give this hero that, well, anti-hero really, who in a millions of ways is unlikable. And yet you're kind of forced to, and at least you playing the game are kind of forced to see it through the end. What do you guys think about that analysis? Do you agree, disagree? And what parts, you know, do you like about JRPGs or don't like about JRPGs that you think this game did a really good job homing in on?
Independent of JRPGs, some of the story, there was a lot of disconnect in the story for me. Like, when I was playing I didn't hate Brad from the beginning. I didn't dislike Brad from the beginning. I recognized that he had his flaws, and I did some reading on the game and found there's like a drug and no drug, or joy and no joy route. So I wasn't taking joy. I wasn't killing everything that I can encounter. And then at some point it shifts, and you don't really have a choice anymore.
Right. It's kind of like Judith, where the game slowly takes choice away from you, and you start, and it kind of slowly reveals the real character that Brad actually is.
In terms of like deconstruction of JRPG tropes, I mean, I grew up playing a lot of JRPGs, so basically all the Super Nintendo JRPGs, and then on to PlayStation, like all the same SquareSoft games that like everybody played on consoles, like around those times. And yeah, I mean, I did find it to be, I had a bit of that sense as well to it, I guess. Actually, this is like slightly tangential to that, but the thing that it reminded me the most of was not like another JRPG, but was the movie Funny Games, if anybody saw that, which is another movie that people have very strong opinions about, and rightly so. Funny Games is a movie, it's by a director that I like, so I watched it. It's kind of my least favorite movie by that director, but it's essentially it's trying to be a deconstruction of the genre that's often referred to as torture porn, meaning like the Saw movies or Hostel or these things, none of which I've seen. It's not my thing, but movies that are just like people having terrible things happen to them, and that's kind of seems to be the main point to a degree. Again, that's said from the perspective of somebody who hasn't really seen a lot of them. But so this movie Funny Games is effectively like setting up one of those types of scenarios where there's these two adolescent kids, and they sort of invade the home of this rich couple that's at their summer home with their kid, and they sort of tie them up, and then now they're going to like play games with them, and that which basically consists of like different types of psychological and physical torture. And the way that the movie tries to like deconstruct those tropes is it keeps breaking the fourth wall, and basically like more and more over the course of the movie, the two perpetrators of these acts start to first like just look in the camera subtly, and then they start like making little offhand comments to like you, the audience, and kind of like winking at you, like kind of like, hey, do you like this stuff that's happening? Like, and kind of just provoking the audience. And so, I mean, people had very strong reactions to that, as I said, because it's simultaneously an attempt to deconstruct and kind of, in a way sort of satirize or what have you, like that type of genre, but it also is of that genre. Like it has all of the things that genre movie has still. And you could argue like it wouldn't be as effective of a deconstruction without those, but I guess there's a difference between whether something is an effective deconstruction for me and whether it's a deconstruction that I want to sit through, like that I feel like was worth my time overall to sit through. So yeah, I mean, I think you can make that argument for Lisa, although I don't have a lot of specific examples besides things that I could tell were referring to specific JRPGs, where I was like, that was a really clever deconstruction of this or that. I mean, it has the kind of single-minded protagonist, obviously, who's going to like finish the quest at all costs of like rescuing, whoever or whatever it is that needs to be rescued. And it kind of plays that out to a crazy extreme. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, what other parts specifically do you think like what aspects of JRPGs do you feel like Lisa was constructing? Because you've played more of it, so I'm curious.
I actually played it all the way to the end. There are a few segments. There's one line, for example, that Buddy provides you. She says, "I'm not a princess. I don't need saving." Right?
Yeah, that's at the end.
And I actually did not get that ending. I just watched somebody else let's play it, and I think so. Basically, my run was don't take any joy drugs, and I think that's what happens. She says something completely different if you don't take any joy drugs. But yeah, that's one element where it makes it clear that the objective you're basically playing the game for was, not an objective meant to be obtained, right? So you start off thinking that you're doing the right thing, and you're pretty much told from the very person that you're supposed to be saving, saying, no, you're not. You're doing the wrong thing throughout this entire game. The game doesn't really have that many like nudge nudge wink winks moments, but there is another one that I thought was a really clever deconstruction of the turn-based battle mechanic, which was there's a part where you can make it to Garbage Island, and at the very end you find a guy that's pointing a gun at his own head. Regardless of what you do, like when you try to talk to him, you immediately go into the battle. And unless you're like super high powered, super high leveled, typically he gets the first turn and shoots his head off. And then you get experience points from doing that. And I thought that was like really clever. It's like this is a guy who is suiciding. You had no effect whatsoever on the conclusion of the battle, and yet you got points for attending that scenario. And I thought like that was like a really to me, that was like one of those really clever moments where it's like, this is wrong. It's very direct method of saying death. Death equaling getting points is a very wrong thing to do.
Yeah. That reminded me of one specific moment, and it's actually bringing back more. Like there were lots of those little moments scattered through that I actually did like, or at least appreciate. It was just that it wasn't quite enough, obviously, to change my overall opinion. But the one that sticks out for me from the first 3 hours that I played was the first dojo, where you're instructed that to learn whatever karate technique or whatever it is, you have to just keep climbing up this cliff and dropping off. And you're not told how many times you need to do this. So I did it once. I went back, and the person just says, like, I'm not impressed yet. Like, keep doing it. And, like, to me, that was not only a very succinct sort of parody of like what grinding is in an RPG, of just climbing up the ladder and dropping off and smacking your head against the concrete floor, which is what I feel like when I'm grinding. But also it was kind of like an encapsulation of the entire experience of playing the game for me. Like the painful RPG, my character is just climbing up a ladder and jumping off and hitting my head with a painful sound effect, and then I can do that I actually thought that was just going to be like, this, my feeling about the game was like, I'm not going to get anything for this. And like, they're just going to keep telling me to keep doing it, and the game's just going to let me do it as many times as I want until I stop. I think I would have liked that more. Like, if I hadn't, like, see, I did it however many more times, 5, 10, whatever, and then I got the thing. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, yeah, I actually feel it would have been slightly more effective if I had to at least like go online and double check to see like, was there any point where I'd be rewarded for this? It's ludicrous either way, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that is kind of clever.
I wonder if during the EWC bit, which is the wrestling part,
Right.
there's a booker, and you can do singles wrestling. You get to the champ, and then he says, you need to feud with him forever. You shouldn't win the next match for the title, so lose. And I wonder if anything ever happens if you just keep losing to him. Because I lost once and then just beat him for the belt.
Yes, you don't get to go through any more wrestling segments anymore. And that's actually one part I wanted to bring up, because that's the part I thought the game was by and far the most broken.
Well, before I went on to face him, I went and did the other stuff first.
Right.
But what I'm wondering is, if you follow the booker's booking and keep losing to the Undertaker guy, if you ever get anything for it.
Yeah, experience points.
Oh, that's right.
And remember how I said that part is the most broken?
Yeah.
So I'm a grinder.
Yeah.
I love grinding, and I know most people don't, but I'm weird like that.
No, I don't like it in this game.
The wrestling segment was where I thought it was the most broken, because I realized very quickly that there's a three different kind of matches that you can take, with the first one being 1-on-1, the second one being 2-on-2, where you get a party member, and the last one being a free-for-all, where you can go all 4 party members and fight it off. You can do that so long as you don't get the title belt at the last the one-on-one versus thing. You can keep doing that forever. And the placement of that is actually kind of unique, because when you look at it very carefully, it's right after where you have a choice of destroying your entire party member. So you can tell that the developer put that segment there just to make sure that you're not stuck you're not stuck with an incredibly low powered party system, and make sure that, hey, you can drop them off and start training at that location. But there's no limit to it, right? Versus, generally speaking, there's a limit with the snakes random encounters, where they have a very high chance of poisoning you. So I thought that segment was like really broken and kind of ruined the fun for me for the game. But that was like the first moment where it actually ruined the fun for me, to be completely honest.
Well, if you had a game where you couldn't reach the end because you got screwed so many times,
right?
What kind of state would that leave you in? Would you go back and start over again, or would you say, screw this, I'm not playing this again? It's
just that I'm saying that a better system could have been placed. One example that immediately comes to my mind, for example, is Shin Megami Tensei Imagine has one segment where you don't really have much control over it. You can toss a monster into a cave and have it train, and it might come back with you. It might come back to you one level up, or it might come back to you with a significant chunk of its health completely depleted and no gain whatsoever. That would have been the kind of system I would have implemented there to kind of really rub it in the player that this is supposed to be a painful game, in the sense that that would be your only option to start leveling up lower powered characters. And at least if your character is like really lower powered, then you skew the probability so that they're more likely to gain a level.
I think the ability to grind in this game really devalues the whole making hard decisions aspect of it, because once you can make the hard decision, say I want to keep both my arms till the end, you can start grinding what you have left.
I think it's kind of another way of torturing you to never be able to be champion.
When you do get to champion, by the way, you actually get another party member as well.
Yeah, Shock Lord, right?
Nope, you get one more character on top of that.
Guy in a bear cave or a wolf.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Sunny.
Yeah, Shock Lord's a reference to Shock Master.
And I think like that is yet another example of the game generally deconstructing JRPGs, in the sense that it tries its best to prevent you from grinding as much as possible. Any sort of grinding segments are typically bad decisions, which is why I say, this segment in particular, where there's no negative consequences for taking on these 4 fellows, I thought was a really bad design on the developer's part, because it felt relatively inconsistent with the rest of the design of the game. But that's, my opinion about that. So, overall, thoughts about your game?
I could make some general comments. I mean, much like the last game, I tend to play games for their gameplay elements. So when you were talking in the introduction about like power fantasies, or I like games that give you freedom, they give you fun gameplay elements. So I can understand why some games might take that stuff away, or not really have a lot of gameplay elements to kind of prove a point or send a message. But to me, that's not like a fun game. That's not like a game I go out wanting to play or get excited about. So like you were saying about certain movies, like there's certain movies I would watch that are not necessarily fun. They have a message, or they might be disturbing or scary, although you could argue that scary can be fun as well. I think the key is that if it's well done, if it's a well done piece of artwork, or if it comes together well, then it would be worth experiencing, even if it's not like a fun experience. But generally, like for me, gaming is about that kind of freedom of making your own decisions, or like being creative. From me as a player, so I think that's one of the things for me that I think gaming is separate from other mediums is if you go watch a movie or you go read a book, you're just seeing somebody's vision. So with gaming, you get to sort of have some, I guess from my interpretation in gaming, you have the option of the player sort of being able to make decisions or be in control to some extent. So you could play a game and decide not to go to the end. You could just sort of do what you want, and you don't have to necessarily even follow a narrative path unless they just force you to do that. So to the extent that some games try to buck the trend by being more movie-like and take that stuff away from you, or taking away your ability to be powerful or grinding or whatever. I think if it was done really well, it would be, if there's other things about the game that were compelling, it might be worth playing, but generally my personal taste is more towards the God mode sandbox type of gameplay where you can really do anything you want to do and just see what happens. Or it's not so much about, like, some people play games that are very linear and challenging and they want to get to the end, but I'm typically not that type of gamer, so I don't really care about getting to the end. I'm not really usually invested in the story because usually I tend not to care much for the story, so I don't think in general this type of game is probably not my favorite genre anyway. So the fact that they're trying to make it even less of that genre, like they're deconstructing the genre, I think it would be more effective if maybe I already like that genre to begin with, but I tend to avoid linear games. I tend to avoid games that rely more on narrative than gameplay. So it didn't seem to work very well for me for those reasons.
I lump games these days into two categories: ones that I like to play and ones that I like to watch. I got as much as I could or as much as I really wanted to out of the first 3 or 4 hours of watching or playing it, but I don't have any desire or need to play it all the way through. But it is something that I did enjoy watching on a Let's Play. I was committed enough to know what happened in the end, no matter how shitty it was. So yeah, it's like sitting there and trying to watch The Road or Mad Max. Nothing good is going to happen in these situations. So I'm not expecting a happy ending and butterflies and sunshine and unicorns and stuff. So on the bright side, the music was awesome.
Music was good.
Yeah, sure. Audio was good.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned like you kind of got what you felt there was to get out of it maybe within the first few hours of playing it. Which, even though I've only played a few hours, that was kind of how I felt about it, was that even if I had had a bit more time and hadn't been playing it right up until the last second, the main thing that I guess made it a bit of a slog for me to play through was that I felt like it was hitting the same kind of tonal notes over and over again. Like the same 3, basically. It was like super wacky, even though it was switching back and forth between like crazy different tones. But I felt like I kind of like... so I mentioned Funny Games as an example, right? Funny Games is a movie that, my basic reaction to it was kind of, when I saw it, was, okay, I get it. Like, it's a movie, like you were mentioning, movies that kind of have maybe a message or a point to them rather than being fun. And, you can kind of get that message whether you agree or disagree with it. And so I watched Funny Games once. I was like, okay, I get it. Like, he's being very critical of these types of movies. I don't really watch those movies anyway too much, so it's maybe not the most relevant message to me, but I would maybe kind of agree with it. But I don't want to, like, then sit through the movie again, necessarily. And so for Lisa, for me, it was just a matter of, like, I felt like I kind of understood what I felt was, like, the point of the experience. Very early, and then I didn't really have a lot of desire to then go and spend like a full 20 hours like just residing inside of that experience and kind of getting hit with the same like emotional beats over and over again. Maybe it was just too painful for me, I don't know. But yeah, so that was one thing for me. It's just like, I mean, the game felt like, you mentioned shock value, Taro, for some of the moments. Like, I would apply the kind of term, like, I feel like that's what the creator was going for with a lot of the aspects of the game, was shock value. And for me, it kind of made me realize more than like any other game or like story or whatever that I've encountered recently, that for me, there is something at this point in my life that feels like empty provocation. Like, it's just a thing that's provoking for the sense of provoking. And like, if I don't, like, I can't say what the author had in mind. Like, I don't really want to speculate too much about that. But like, for me, for my experience, like, it doesn't really matter too much. Like, it was just, unless I have like a level of trust built up in the author where I feel like the things that are happening for some purpose that I'm going to be like happy that I went, like, not happy, like, not that it was fun or whatever, but I'm going to feel like there was some worthwhile reason why I kind of made the trek through that 20 hours of horribleness. If I don't feel that way, like, if I feel like it's just, I'm going to wade through the swamp for the sake of wading through it, then I'd kind of rather not. And I don't know, I guess that's just where I'm at with it at the moment. The last thing that like will stick with me about it was the humor, as I mentioned. Like, there a lot of it had to do with the tone and like the tightrope that it's walking with the tone, which I think is really tricky to hit. I don't think, for me, it didn't hit it. I really like works that do like walk that tightrope where there's like this mix of humor and like darkness. It's just so tricky to actually get there. And I think a lot of it comes down for me with Lisa to like the parts that are like comedy or wacky. It's like, who is the joke on, kind of, like who are we laughing at? Who or what are we laughing at? And that was the part that really made me the most uncomfortable about the game, more than anything else, even more than some of like the horrible stuff that's happening. It's like, there's a lot of characters making wacky jokes about like women or whatever it is. Like, and I don't know, like, a lot of times I'm critical of people who feel like they need a work to like spell out exactly how they're supposed to feel about the thing that's being presented. But it really made me uncomfortable in a way that made me want to stop playing. So maybe that's like the success of the game, is like, I just don't, it's like, who is this humor for? And like, what, it wasn't funny to me, and I didn't understand who it was meant to be funny to. And I kind of started to feel, the more I played it, and even just watching other parts of the game, like, the joke is on you, the player. Like there's a bit where you climb up this long rope. It tells you something good is at the top, but the game has done so many variations and permutations on that already. So you kind of already know, like, there's just going to be some nonsense at the top of this. Like, I shouldn't even climb it. But like, it kind of does prey on that, that's like your instinct as a player. Like, fine, I'll go to the top of this rope. Takes like a few minutes to climb or whatever, and then there's a middle finger statue at the top. And it's like, okay, yes, so the joke really is on me, the player. And so that's an interesting way to approach a game as a designer, being kind of very contentious towards the player and saying how much pain are you willing to kind of take. Sort of like a little S&M relationship between player and designer. For me, I guess I'm not enough of a masochist to really get too far in it. So that was my experience.
Are we guilty of that with Laundry Day?
We're probably guilty of it on a smaller scale. We lack the grand ambition. We've got practice.
Yeah. Well, I didn't like it. Audio was cool. The game made me anxious really anxious in a bad way. So that's not for me. The game's not for me.
So I'm going to be the outlier and say I personally enjoyed the game. I was largely expecting a very Spec Ops-aligned kind of storyline where the joke is pretty much on the player, and was pretty satisfied with that. I thought that a lot of the mechanics, as mentioned earlier, especially in regards to your party members, was really fascinating to kind of look through and understand what kind of economics was going on and what kind of intense and what kind of relationship with the game you're supposed to have as a consequence of that. So to me, as a game designer, I thought it was a really fascinating study in game design, as well as a really fascinating study in aspects of understanding, what part of JRPGs work and why this game, makes fun of those kind of parts, to kind of say, if you really think about it, that's not really supposed to be fun or interesting or anything that you're actually really supposed to enjoy. So I kind of really like that aspect of it. As mentioned earlier, any points that you can grind in the game, I actually did not like, even though I'm a grinder myself, because I thought it effectively broke the illusion of the game many times. So that was kind of like my line of thinking of it. I did like how the game ended, personally. Yes, it ends on a very depressing note, but it ends on a very fascinating and unusual note that you would not expect from most video games. This coming from a guy who, albeit said, I thought Chrono Trigger was outdated and not a very fun game, did not age well at all. What the heck? So who knows?
No one here agrees with him.
For the record.
Yep. So glad you guys actually spent the time to play through this and kind of trug through the very dystopian, and by very dystopian, very thoroughly dystopian world, unlike, Fallout, where you can eventually become the most powerful guy, whereas in this game it's more like you can still become that, but it doesn't make you feel any better, right? So with that out of the way, that's the conclusion of this meeting, and let's start talking about
Hello, my name is Alana O'Hare. I'll be the host for the next game club that's coming up at June 25th, 2015. The next game we'll be talking about is Spore from Maxis and EA. Spore was the last game created by legendary game designer Will Wright, who famously created SimCity, and 4 years prior had created The Sims 2, one of the most popular games ever on PC. Spore is a game that has 5 distinct stages, where the user is allowed to create a single-celled organism, and then an intelligent organism, and then start using technology, buildings, vehicles, and eventually a spaceship that can travel the galaxy. The game is available digitally in physical disc copies between $12 and $20. I hope to see you next month.